Hungary did not build the Black Army because Matthias Corvinus wanted military prestige. It emerged because the kingdom was being pressed at once from the south by Ottoman frontier warfare, from the north by Hussite-derived mercenary violence, and from the west by dynastic rivalry. What made the Black Army important was not simply that it was formidable, but how it answered that structural problem. And contrary to later legend, this was never just a famous mercenary corps. It was a flexible military instrument whose real function is often misunderstood. In the 15th century, the Kingdom of Hungary was not simply another European monarchy facing an external rival. It was a frontier state, and that distinction shaped everything. Ottoman expansion into the Balkans was cumulative pressure, not a single dramatic break. The defeats at Varna in 1444 and the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448 mattered because they exposed the limits of coalition warfare. But the fall of Constantinople to Mehmed II in 1453 changed the larger geometry of the region. After that, the kingdom faced not only the possibility of invasion, but the steady compression of its strategic depth. That is the first point to keep in view. The second is that the real danger was not confined to headline battles. As Colin Imber has argued, Ottoman warfare on the Balkan frontier was characterized by continuous small war, and that term can mislead if taken too lightly. These were raids, abductions, burnings, livestock seizures, and the repeated stripping of wealth and manpower from exposed districts. What they produced was attrition in the strict sense, demographic loss, fiscal depletion, and chronic insecurity in the border zone. Thomas Palsofalvi is right to emphasize the destructive consequences of that process. The existential threat of conquest remained real, but the daily problem was slower and more corrosive. Hungary was being worn down, and that pressure forced military reform. Frontier warfare in southern Hungary was not defined by a single advancing line on a map. It was a zone of constant friction stretching across river crossings, fortresses, market towns, and vulnerable agricultural districts in the Balkans. In practice, what contemporaries faced was a cycle of raids, counter-raids, reconnaissance, prisoner-taking, and the systematic destruction of productive capacity. Villages could be emptied in hours, herds driven off, mills burned, and labor power removed from the kingdom, one convoy of captives at a time. These operations unfolded not only at the edge of settled borders, but also around sieges and through wider campaign zones where control was never fully secure. That is why older feudal responses struggled. Levy systems could assemble men for a campaign, but they were poorly suited to repeated mobile incursions that demanded speed, endurance, and readiness across long periods. The Hungarian response therefore developed as a layered system before the Black Army took recognizable shape. Buffer states formed an outer screen. Behind them stood a chain of border fortresses, the fixed backbone of the defense, running through key southern zones that later historians would trace toward nodes such as Nándor-Fehérvár or Belgrade and Jajce. Recruitment structures were also adjusted to widen the available manpower pool, while light cavalry grew in importance because reaction time mattered as much as battlefield weight. This adaptation came from pressure, not military fashion. As Thomas Palosfalvi's work makes clear, reform was driven by the need to slow attrition on the frontier, while scholarship on fortification chains and border defense shows how deliberately this system was built despite repeated setbacks. It was an improvised resilience, but a real one, and it awaited a ruler prepared to turn that defensive logic into a more coherent military instrument. When Matthias Corvinus was elected king in 1458, the problem before him was not simply that Hungary needed stronger armies. It was that the crown faced three simultaneous crises, each with its own military logic. In the south, Ottoman pressure continued to grind against the frontier. In the north, Upper Hungary was troubled by Hussite and post-Hussite mercenary bands, many of them Czechs and Moravians, hardened by a military tradition that outlived the main Hussite wars and now fed organized raiding and local instability. In the west and at the center of the kingdom's politics, the situation was even more delicate. Powerful magnates supported Frederick III, and that conflict was sharpened by a problem of legitimacy, not merely diplomacy. Frederick possessed the crown of St. Stephen, which had come into his hands through the dynastic struggles connected to Elizabeth of Luxembourg and the inheritance of Ladislaus Posthumus. That mattered because sacral kingship in Hungary was not an abstraction. A scholarship on Hungarian coronation and royal legitimacy has long emphasized a ruler who lacked the proper crown and proper coronation could govern, but his title remained exposed. Matthias therefore faced three immediate priorities. He had to secure his own legitimacy in a legal and symbolic sense. He had to pacify Upper Hungary and neutralize the armed networks operating there. And he had to deter the Ottomans without exhausting the kingdom in a premature trial of strength. This is often misunderstood if the story is told as the rise of an energetic ruler building an elite army by force of will. The army emerged in response to a structural problem with dynastic, political, and frontier dimensions. Matthias inherited pressure from every side, and that pressure made a more reliable instrument of war indispensable.
Before the Black Army became a recognizable institution, Hungary already possessed military structures that were serviceable in theory but limited in practice. The crown could draw on the banderial system, meaning the armed followings maintained by great lords and ecclesiastical magnates, each expected to appear with retainers equipped at their own expense. Alongside that stood the militia portalis, a levy principle tied to peasant holdings, by which, in simplified terms, one mounted archer was to be produced for a given number of plots. The exact ratio shifted over time and is worth treating carefully, but the underlying point is clear enough. These arrangements could generate manpower. They could not guarantee coherence. Readiness was uneven because service depended on local preparation, seasonal constraints, and the willingness of elites whose interests did not always align neatly with those of the crown. Quality varied as well. Some contingents were competent and well-mounted, others far less reliable, and neither system was designed for constant rapid response across multiple fronts. That mattered because frontier warfare did not wait for a formal muster. Raiding columns moved quickly, and a king dealing with Upper Hungary, the southern border, and Habsburg rivalry needed troops available when required, not merely after summons, negotiation, and delay. Political reliability posed an additional problem in a kingdom where magnate power remained substantial. A force raised through noble obligation could serve the realm, but it could also reflect the fragmentation of the realm. What Matthias needed was different. Troops whose quality was more consistent, whose availability was more immediate, and whose function could shift from suppression to siege warfare to field campaigning without rebuilding the army each time. In that sense, the crown was attempting to centralize coercive capacity without the fiscal machinery later states would develop more fully, a difficulty that becomes clearer when set beside recruitment patterns elsewhere in Europe. The turning point came when Matthias, under heavy strain, chose to buy settlement with Frederick and convert hostile mercenary manpower into royal service.
The decisive step came through negotiation, money, and political realism, rather than through a single founding decree. Matthias reached terms with Frederick III, and part of the settlement involved substantial payment. At the same time, he secured the services of Jan Jiskra, whose forces had previously been part of the problem in Upper Hungary. That achieved two things at once. It strengthened Matthias's claim to rule by helping recover the crown of St. Stephen, and it redirected experienced mercenary manpower into royal service. The army that later came to be known as the Black Army therefore emerged in response to a structural problem, but it did not appear fully formed. Its development was gradual, contingent, and shaped by campaign needs. Thomas Palosvalvi has stressed that it became a more permanent institution only in the 1470s, which is an important correction because the term standing army can suggest a level of standardization that does not fit the evidence cleanly. Even the name requires caution. Black Army was a later label, and its etymology remains uncertain. One explanation ties it to a captain nicknamed the Black. Another connects it to black armor, though that theory is usually treated skeptically. Matthias's own correspondence points in a different direction, because in a letter describing the force, he makes clear that it was not uniform either in appearance or in composition. This is often misunderstood. The army was mixed by design. It included heavy cavalry, light cavalry, infantry, and master gunners or artillery specialists. In its earlier phases, many of its men were Czechs, Moravians, Poles, and Germans, with Hungarians becoming more prominent over time as recruitment widened and royal control deepened. Its internal structure also deserves precision. The infantry was not a single undifferentiated mass. There were more heavily equipped foot soldiers, often identified in the sources as armati, alongside shield-bearers using large pavises, and behind or between them stood men armed with pikes, spears, halberts, crossbows, and early firearms. In practice, this allowed a defensive formation that could approximate a moving fortified line, shields forward, pikes projecting, missile troops firing under cover, and cohesion maintained while the body advanced or held ground. The logic had affinities with Hussite wagon fort practice and with Western pike square methods, but it should not be reduced to either. What mattered most was hybridization. The Black Army adapted existing tactical languages into a more flexible system.
That mattered operationally because discipline and coherence gave Matthias something the older levy system could not reliably provide. These troops could be shifted across fronts, used in sieges, deployed in suppression, and coordinated more effectively than ad hoc noble contingents. Yet they were not a modern standing army in the later early modern sense. They were a professionalizing royal force, assembled under pressure, increasingly durable but still variable in scale and composition according to strategic need. Once that institutional shape becomes clear, the next question is the crucial one, not what the army looked like on paper, but how it actually worked in the frontier war for which it was created. Once the Black Army is placed back into the conditions of Ottoman frontier warfare, the familiar image of it as primarily an infantry force begins to fall apart. Contrary to popular belief, the most consequential development under Matthias was the rising importance of light cavalry, later associated with the Hussars. These riders were suited to the kind of war Hungary was actually fighting in the south. They carried bows or crossbows, lances, sabers, and shields, and their style reflected a mixture of influences from the Balkan borderlands, probably including Serbian practice, while also adapting to methods long used by Ottoman light horse. What mattered was not their romance, but their utility. They could scout, screen, harass, pursue, and respond quickly across a frontier where time was often more important than mass. That is the key to how the system actually worked. The Southern War was defined by raids and counter-raids, by mobile incursions that had to be intercepted before they stripped another district of livestock, grain, and labor. In that environment, slow concentration of heavy forces was rarely the ideal answer, light cavalry was. Even major actions could reflect that logic. The victory at Kenyamezo, or Breadfield, in 1479 is often remembered as a set-piece success, but it still belongs within this broader operational world of mobility and frontier response. Matthias himself, in a letter often cited in this discussion, gave figures of roughly 20,000 cavalry to 8,000 infantry. That should not be treated as an exact census, but it does point clearly enough to the balance of emphasis. As Thomas Pallasfalvi has argued, the older picture of the Black Army as mainly infantry has been decisively undermined.
Infantry still mattered, it mattered greatly, but its role was different. Infantry garrisoned castles, supported sieges, and was especially useful in the northern and western theaters, where campaigns against Frederick III and other opponents required sustained operations against fortified places. On the southern line, forts such as Jajce after 1463 and Szabadsz after 1475 formed part of the wider defensive structure, and that structure was the real backbone of the defense. Fortresses provided bases, storage, and protected nodes of resistance. Light cavalry formed the active arm. Infantry gave the system staying power through siege work and garrison duty. This also explains Matthias's strategic caution. He generally avoided open battle with the main Ottoman field army because attritional defense, backed by fortification chains and mobile response forces, made better sense than seeking a decisive clash on unfavorable terms. Hungary held because it adapted to the enemy's force composition instead of trying to mirror it symmetrically. And once that logic is clear, the next step is to see where it produced its most visible payoff. The clearest demonstration of the system's effectiveness came not on the Ottoman frontier, but in the west. When conflict with Frederick III resumed, the Black Army operated in the theater for which its infantry, artillery, and siege discipline were especially well suited. Here, fortified places mattered more than fast-moving border interception, and Matthias could concentrate strength where success was attainable. The capture of Vienna in 1485 was the symbolic and operational peak of that strategy. Contemporary accounts and later reconstructions emphasize the material means involved: 17 siege guns, 2 siege towers, and an infantry assault that finally broke the city's resistance. This is where the earlier institutional detail pays off. The same force that had helped stabilize a pressured kingdom could also be used as a cross-front instrument of royal power. The significance should be stated carefully. Hungary was not replacing the Ottoman threat with Western conquest as its primary mission. Matthias was containing pressure in the south while projecting force westward where the balance of opportunity was more favorable. That was the logic. He avoided decisive overcommitment against the main Ottoman field army, but he did not remain strategically passive. He chose his arenas. Vienna shows what that choice could produce. Matthias then resided in the city after its fall, which underlined the scale of the achievement without changing its underlying meaning. This was not theatrical glory. It was proof that a military instrument built under severe constraint could, for a time, deliver results of the highest order. The deeper question is, what such effectiveness cost to maintain?
The system worked. That is the first conclusion. The second is that it was extraordinarily expensive to keep working. After Mehmed II died in 1481, Bayezid II pursued different priorities, and the immediate likelihood of a major Ottoman collision with Hungary declined. But that did not mean the frontier became quiet. Border warfare continued through raiding, counter-raiding, and the persistent pressure exerted by Ottoman lords along the marches. The southern line still had to be guarded permanently. That meant paying not only for the Black Army's professional corps, but also for the frontier forces tied to the fortification chain, and for additional banderial or levy-based contingents when broader mobilization was required. In effect, Hungary was sustaining several military systems at once. That burden matters even more when placed in comparative context. As fiscal military scholarship has long emphasized, kingdoms such as France and powers such as Venice moved only gradually toward the regular retention of large standing forces because the costs were so severe. Matthias's Hungary was attempting something unusually demanding for its resource base and geopolitical position. What mattered most in the end was not simply battlefield competence, but sustainability. A strong army can solve immediate problems and still undermine the state that maintains it if the administrative and fiscal structure behind it remains too narrow. That is why Matthias's death in 1490 was such a turning point. The system had depended on his political authority, his strategic choices, and his willingness to extract revenue at a punishing level. Without that center,
the Black Army could not be maintained. It was abandoned, fragmented, or allowed to disintegrate soon afterward because the crown could no longer bear the cost. The larger lesson is not that military innovation failed. It is that effective adaptation can create future fragility when military ambition advances faster than the institutions required to sustain it. The Black Army matters not because it was simply a famous mercenary corps, but because it reveals how a frontier monarchy tried to solve three linked problems at once: attrition on the southern border, dynastic insecurity at the center, and the limits of older recruitment structures. In practice, it was one part of a wider Hungarian military system, and its success was real, so was its cost. Tactical effectiveness and operational flexibility did not guarantee fiscal durability. That is the larger lesson. Military adaptation can be brilliant and still prove unsustainable. If this approach was useful, continue with the next episode on frontier warfare, Hussite tactics, or Ottoman-Hungarian conflict.